Good evening, everyone who is joining us remotely. Thank you for being here. We're going to give it a minute or so and then we'll start. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for being here tonight. We are happy to be sharing the draft of our racial equity framework for transportation. My name is Kathleen Mayell. I'm with the City of Minneapolis Public Works Department, Transportation Planning and Programming Division, and I am a transportation planning manager in that group, and I've been working on this project for quite some time, and I'm happy to be here with colleagues both that will be presenting with me, Bria Fast, who she'll introduce herself when she takes over, as well as some colleagues in the background. So thank you all for being with us this evening. And I'm just trying to make sure the slides are advancing. So tonight we're going to talk about the racial equity framework, give an overview, the impetus for the work, share what's in the draft racial equity framework, and talk about how to share feedback, and then go through any questions or comments from the audience. In terms of asking questions or sharing comments this evening, if you're coming from your computer, there's a ask a question button on the lower right corner of your window. You can check a box to ask anonymously if you so choose. And when we get to the questions within the question and answer period, we will publish those questions so everyone can see them. If you're on your phone, you can select the Q&A question mark on the upper right side of the screen and then go through the same steps as above. And if you lose audio, just check to see if you pause the live meeting. That does happen sometimes. So to begin, what is the racial equity framework for transportation? This document, when it is done, will guide future transportation plans, programs, and projects. It will reframe how we talk about and measure equity within transportation work in the city. The framework contains strategies and actions that will direct future work of public works transportation staff through 2030, and it will really become an integral part of the city's planning and policy guidance for transportation work within the city. The timeline of how we've come to this point. So in December of 2020, the city adopted the Transportation Action Plan, and within that, there was some policy direction to do this work. We spent the next year developing an approach and really grounding ourselves internally to frame up this work, do some background research, and really think about structure of how to get this work done, which led us to partnering with the Cultural Wellness Center, an organization with deep roots in South Minneapolis. They've been around about 30 years. To partner with them for the better part of this past year on this work, and namely forming a community equity work group that met 6 times from April to September of this year, and really provided great feedback and insight into the different elements that we worked on through the racial equity framework. This group was comprised of about anywhere from 5 to 15 core people with either professional or personal ties to organizations that were really looking at similar issues throughout Minneapolis. And that leads us to now in late 2022, where we have our draft racial equity framework out for public comment, and we will come back next year after the public comment period ends to adopt the final. So just one other quick note on the Cultural Wellness Center and the Community Equity Work Group that we formed. This was really a critical partnership. There was a Did You Know community event earlier this week that actually members from the Community Equity Work Group really presented on the racial equity framework, and staff from the Cultural Wellness Center to share kind of about the process and ground the community members in what the racial equity framework for transportation was and how it would impact things going forward. Additionally, we shared and connected with folks on our pedestrian and bicycle advisory committees at the city. We were at our Community Connections Conference. We were at different open streets events in the summer. And we've shared also this information through our city website, newsletter, and the public comment period that we currently have ongoing. So when we talk about the impetus for the work and why we're doing this work, there's really 2 reasons. One is the historic inequities that we see within transportation, and the second hand is the policy, and we'll get to that in a second. Now, this is a very high-level overview summarizing some major movements or themes within our historical context. On the left, we have the Homeowner Loan Corporation map produced in the 1930s, which really defined where banks were willing to give loans for mortgages, and commonly referred to as redlining maps. You can see the red areas which were designated hazardous or unsafe or unfit to give loans, and then gradually, more better ratings. And this really had some really dramatic impacts, not just in Minneapolis, all over cities all over the nation. And then when you show where that, and these red lines were really based on race and also religion. A lot of these red line areas were also, restricting only that Jewish people couldn't live in an area or couldn't get a loan for a house in an area, as well as Black and other people of color in Minneapolis. Looking at the middle map, we see a map of where the Black population was in 1940s in different neighborhoods, the most populous Black neighborhoods in Minneapolis. And that's really when planning for the interstate freeway system began in earnest. And you can see where the interstates really ended up in Minneapolis, cutting through the heart of many of these communities, bifurcating them and leaving those who remained on the edges to deal with the impacts of pollution, noise, barriers, and a degradation of their community that had once been where those freeways were. And you can see the lasting impacts on the right, where you see this is a dot map of different, based on race, of current population or 2010 population in Minneapolis. And you can really see that there are similar trends dating from the redlining, where the freeways were, and then different population groups within Minneapolis. This is just another way to look at it. This is taken from the Human Toll exhibit on 35W that's at the Hennepin History Museum. Both Minneapolis and St. Paul showing the major Black neighborhoods in the 1960s or in 1960. And then really these pink lines are the interstates, and showing how they really just, bend and curve to get right through. And so these are acts by the federal government on down that really had lasting, deep impacts on our Black community in Minneapolis and others. When you look at, that's a very brief history of some of the links here, and then bringing it more to the present day. The Twin Cities metro area compared nationwide to the most populous areas really rates so high when it comes to employment, homeownership, low poverty, per capita income. If you are a white resident, if you are a resident of color, you're ranking the Twin Cities area ranks worst or near worst compared to other major cities in the U.S. And so using this racial equity framework for transportation, it's acknowledging that past, it's looking at the current inequities that exist both in terms of these type of outcomes, so socioeconomic outcomes, but as well as the transportation related outcomes. So this is a chart showing the impacts, or not impacts, the traffic deaths that from 2011 to 2019, and shows a disproportionate amount of Native American residents impacted by traffic deaths across all modes, and then Black residents disproportionately impacted by fatal vehicle crashes. So an overrepresentation of our Black and Native American residents within this. And then some things that aren't maybe quite as dramatic as traffic fatalities, but still really important. So average commute times, if you're a white worker in Minneapolis, is less by 5 minutes a day than a Black worker, or by per commute. So that's 10 minutes a day. And that really adds up. That adds hours of time where you're not with your family, not, doing something you love and enjoy, not exercising, not having, being with your friends or family. So that's an important metric to look at. And then also looking at who has access to a car. So 31% people of color households in Minneapolis do not have access to a car, and that's 12% for white households. So then when you think about how we design our streets and what modes we design our streets for, how are we providing for folks when almost a third of our color of households do not have access to a car? And so tying this all together, linking these themes, bringing them to the forefront about how we do our work is really a focus of this racial equity framework. All of this is really meant to uphold and support the city's definition and goal around racial equity, which is the development of policies, practices, and strategic investments to reverse racial disparity trends, eliminate institutional racism, and ensure that outcomes and opportunities for all people are no longer predictable by race. So we're using transportation as one element of how, as a city, we can hopefully get to this outcome. With this work, we're building upon a strong policy direction for a new future. So just in the past 5 years, or fewer than 5 years, we've had Minneapolis 2040. We've had the Strategic and Racial Equity Action Plan that was put out, our Transportation Action Plan, our Street Design Guide, which really shows how to build streets and design streets that really embody these themes and policies, and our Vision Zero commitment. So the commitment to end all traffic fatalities and severe injuries on our streets. So with this racial equity framework for transportation, we hope to put a finer point and tie the connections of racial equity within the transportation work that we have been building over the last several years. I mentioned that the Transportation Action Plan really set the policy impetus for this work. That is a 10-year document that was passed in 2020 to guide our transportation systems over the next decade. And we released that draft plan in March of 2020, right before the pandemic hit, and the comment period ended right before George Floyd was murdered on a Minneapolis street. And so one of the main things we did in between the draft and final plan was take a deep look at how this plan met the moment in Minneapolis right then, that summer of 2020, and seeing where the city was at moving forward. And 3 new strategies that we included in the Transportation Action Plan are listed here. And the first one was to implement a racial equity framework for transportation. So each strategy within the Transportation Action Plan has a series of actions, and these are 6 that I've listed here within the Transportation Action Plan, that strategy that really guided the work of creating this racial equity framework. So tying to citywide efforts with support and in collaboration with Black, Indigenous, and people of color within the city, that we're defining and setting racial equity goals, that we're acknowledging the historic harms and transportation inequities within the city, that we're reevaluating the way that we've looked at equity from a data perspective in transportation, and that we are updating metrics. And so that is all laid out in our draft racial equity framework and more, which we will share in a minute. I will, with that, hand it over to my colleague Bria Fast, and we will answer any questions at the end. Thank you.
And hi, everyone. My name is Bria Fast. I'm a transportation planner, and I also work in the Transportation Planning and Programming Division in Public Works, along with Kathleen. I'll be going into a little bit more detail as to what's in the racial equity framework for transportation in the document itself in subsequent slides. This slide right here just gives an overview of what the REF contains. So there are three main sections. Starts with an executive summary, there's the main document, and then an appendix, and that has additional and supplemental information. It includes maps, a glossary of terms, and other information. With this document, we are stating unequivocally that we are committed to creating an equitable transportation system in Minneapolis. The racial equity framework for transportation, it has 4 goals. These are on the screen. These 4 goals help us organize our strategies and our actions, and they were also a really big part of our engagement process. The community equity work group, as well as our internal work group, played a big role in their development and how they've evolved and changed. Along with the transportation equity commitment, we also want to acknowledge that past harm has been done, and that government-supported systems and decisions have excluded, harmed, and overburdened communities of color, especially Black and Indigenous communities in Minneapolis. These decisions have led to disproportionate burdens that communities of color in Minneapolis definitely face today. This acknowledgement here is directly called out in the Transportation Action Plan in Progress Action 1.4 as well. In public works and in transportation at the city, we prioritize investments in our transportation projects in many different ways, but a major factor in this project prioritization has been to look at ACP 50 areas. With this work that we are talking about tonight, we're adjusting this prioritization based on the TEP scores, or Transportation Equity Priority Areas. The TEP score was developed with guidance from the Met Council, and this was to acknowledge that equity is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all term, and to design a way of identifying equity priority areas in the city that are unique to our specific community. The data that informs this score was chosen from a really big list of equity data that was suggested by the Met Council. And it went through a pretty robust engagement process that we've been talking about. So that includes our various internal working groups, as well as the community equity work group and input from the Cultural Wellness Center. The Transportation Equity Priority Score uses what we've been calling a 2-score methodology. So this consists of a base equity score and what we're calling an equity plus score. The base score consists of race and income data, and we measure income in 3 different ways. So you can see those bubbles, the light blue underneath income. So lowest income, low income, as well as lack of concentrated affluence, which means communities that have the least amount of concentrated affluence within them. Our Equity Plus score is made up of layers that are especially relevant to our transportation work. And some of this data includes vehicle availability, commute time, demographics, such as population density, and then environmental data, which is average land temperature. So the Transportation Equity Priority Score, it adds a lot of nuance in how we view equity citywide. So on your screen are 3 maps. The ACP 50 areas are on the left in that golden yellow color. This most recent data is from 2019. The Transportation Equity Priority Score, or areas, excuse me, are on the right on that purple map. So the darkest is the highest priority, the lightest is the lowest priority on that map. And then the one in the middle shows the overlap between the 2 of these things. So you can see that yellow outline over the Transportation Equity Priority Score areas. So the TEP score really expands upon what you're seeing with ACP 50 areas, but what it does is avoid the in or the out binary. So again, with ACP 50, you either are or you aren't one. Whereas when we're looking at transportation equity priority areas, there are 5 different tiers, and again, it's not necessarily you are or you aren't, but rather sort of a gradation of where different census tracts in Minneapolis fall. The racial equity framework has 24 strategies and 64 actions, and these are all aligned around those 4 goals that we showed earlier on. So these strategies and actions, along with the transportation equity priority score, are really tangible ways that the racial equity framework will impact transportation plans, programs, and projects. So, we just have one slide here on these strategies and actions, but again, there's 24 strategies and 64 actions, and these are really, really important ways that the racial equity framework will show up again in those kind of tangible, real ways in work moving forward. These are framed in a very similar fashion as the strategies and actions in the Transportation Action Plan as well, including how we frame them around difficulty, timing, and more. We will be tracking our progress through 2030 through 10 different metrics, 10 key metrics, and indicators. So the 5 tracking indicators on the left, they all measure broader change, whereas the 5 key metrics on the right represent areas where we can measure quantifiable progress. The way that we're going to report our progress will also follow the structure of the Transportation Action Plan. So the Racial Equity Framework progress will be included in the Transportation Action Plan report back every 2 years. We just had one recently. So again, the first will be then 2 years from now. And the Transportation Equity Priority Score will replace the ACP 50 designation in the Your City, Your Streets report back, and that's annually. The Transportation Equity Dashboard is a web page, and it shares deeper, more detailed information about racial equity and transportation equity citywide. The dashboard itself includes 5 different tabs, and these provide an introduction to the racial equity framework. It provides an interactive story map that links readers to really important equity resources, such as the Just Deeds project. It takes a closer look at the data that informs the Transportation Equity Priority Score and equity data in general in Minneapolis. And then there's the Racial Equity Framework Executive Summary, as well as different ways to engage and provide feedback on the work. So also this dashboard, it's not an official part of the Racial Equity Framework that Council needs to approve, but it is a resource and a tool for residents and transportation professionals within Public Works itself. And this is an example of the dashboard interface, what it looks like. You can see those 5 tabs along the top that have those different resources and ways to connect with the information. And then, again, these go all the way from learning about transportation equity in general to engaging really directly with our process moving forward.
With that overview, we'll go back, or we'll kind of start the part of the meeting, the public meeting tonight, in terms of sharing feedback. So tonight is certainly an opportunity to feedback and typing the questions in, as I had mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Our website, which this is a long link here, but if you Google search Racial Equity Framework for Transportation Minneapolis, it'll lead you to it as well. There's a link to a form there as well that'll be open and active through January 20th, and we'll plan to, as mentioned earlier, post public comment period, reflect on all the comments, make some changes and bring this back to City Council in early 2023. So with that, we have listed on the next slide, the form that is linked from our website has 6 different questions on it, which we can leave up here. If anybody wants to share anything on these or have other questions for us, we're happy to take those. And then I can pop up here too, I'll go back to the slide we were just at. This is Bria and my contact info. If anyone else, if you'd like to reach out to us in that way as well. And a quick reminder how you can access the questions from the web or a mobile device. With that, I'll pop back to this screen and we'll see if there are any questions from anyone in the audience. All right, if there are any questions or anyone in the audience who has a comment, happy to take those at this time. Otherwise, we can, I think, stand by just to ensure that other comments don't come on or anyone else doesn't pop on. Thanks everyone for being here tonight.